The mornings in Fairhaven, a small, tree-lined town in central Pennsylvania, always came gently. Soft clouds drifting across the sky, the scent of earth and pine in the air, and a quiet that wrapped around the houses like an old quilt. But for Emily Harper, mornings didn't feel gentle. They felt heavy. They arrived too early, too loud, pressing into her chest before she even opened her eyes. At 27, Emily lived in a modest second-floor apartment above a shuttered bookstore, her bedroom window overlooking Main Street, where wind chimes often whispered secrets to one another. On the outside, nothing about her life appeared fractured. She worked in a local flower shop called the Wild Bloom, arranging sunflowers, orchids, and roses with delicate precision. Customers liked her quiet kindness, her instinct to listen more than speak. They smiled when she handed them bouquets wrapped in brown paper, never knowing that her own life had withered in ways none of them could see. Emily had once believed in love. Not the fairy tale kind, but the soft, real sort, the kind that holds you on bad days and reminds you of who you are when you've forgotten. She gave that belief to a man named Ryan, who dismantled it piece by piece. He hadn't been cruel with fists or loud threats. His weapon was slower, sharper, words. You're too emotional. No one else would put up with you. You're lucky I even stayed this long. And then, the final cut, no one will ever love you. He left her on a Thursday, his keys left on the kitchen table, a single sentence hanging in the air like a ghost. Emily didn't cry immediately. She sat down on the couch, stared at the keys, and felt her body go still, like something had been unplugged. In the weeks that followed, she moved through life like someone underwater, doing her job, paying her bills, answered her phone with soft lies like, "I'm doing okay," when friends from college called. But nights were different. Nights were merciless. That was when her thoughts would circle back to his voice. Not just what he said, but how he said it, flat, certain, as if he was simply stating a fact. She began to look at herself through his eyes. Each trip past a mirror became a trial. She'd stand still and study her face, the soft line of her jaw, the small scar on her left eyebrow, the way her shoulders curved inward as if an apology. She stopped wearing lipstick, stopped taking pictures, stopped imagining what she'd look like in sunlight. It wasn't that she believed Ryan entirely. A part of her, a small, stubborn part, knew that what he'd said wasn't the truth. But words like his didn't need to be true to take root. They just needed time and repetition. And she had given them both. Months passed like this. She went to work. She came home. She cooked simple meals and let them go cold. She watched films she'd seen 100 times, just to feel like something in her life was familiar. Her world had shrunk to the size of her apartment and the flower shop. Her voice, once full of ideas and questions, had become quieter, careful. As if too much sound might draw attention, she didn't know how to handle. And yet, even in this muted existence, something inside her resisted. It started with a note on her bathroom mirror, written in red marker. "You don't have to believe him." She didn't remember writing it. It must have been one of those nights where she tried to push back. But there it was, the letters slightly smudged from steam. She left it there. Then came small acts of rebellion. She bought a new plant for her kitchen windowsill. She said no when a customer was rude to her for the first time in years. She walked into a bookstore one Sunday and stayed for 3 hours, reading poetry. These weren't victories. Not really. But they were movements. Tiny ripples in a pond that had long been still. Emily didn't speak of the breakup to anyone. Not even to her co-worker Sarah, who had once offered wine and bad movies after seeing the hollow look in her eyes. Emily had smiled and said she was just tired. That was her refrain, just tired. But Sarah saw more than she let on. One evening, after closing the shop, Sarah walked over with a cup of lavender tea and said, without pressing, "You deserve to feel whole again, you know." Emily didn't answer, but the word stayed. One cold November night, she found herself sitting on her living room floor, surrounded by old journals. She opened one from college, the year she met Ryan, and read through pages full of ambition and longing. She had wanted to be a writer then. She had loved thunderstorms and cooking for friends. She had described herself as a girl who feels too much, but hopes anyway. And there, in her own handwriting, was proof she hadn't always been like this. She had once been someone. That night, she cried, not because of Ryan, not entirely, but because she missed herself, and that, in its quiet, broken way, was the beginning, not of healing, not yet, but of remembering. Remembering that even a wound, invisible as it may be, aches not because you're weak, but because something in you is still alive, still fighting to be heard. And Emily, somewhere in that silence, was starting to listen. It was a Saturday in early spring when Emily stepped out of her apartment with no plan, but to breathe air that wasn't saturated with silence. The snow had melted a week ago, leaving behind damp sidewalks and the earthy scent of awakening. Sarah, her co-worker, had mentioned a new cafe downtown, one with mismatched chairs, art on the walls, and supposedly the best almond croissants in Fairhaven. "Just go," she'd said with a teasing smile. "Pretend you're someone who does things." So Emily went. She didn't dress up, didn't wear makeup. Her hair was tied back in a loose braid, her jacket a bit too worn, but she walked with a kind of quiet purpose, as if answering a whisper only she could hear. The bell above the cafe door chimed softly when she pushed it open. The warmth inside was immediate, and not just from the heaters. The walls were painted a muted sage green, and shelves held tiny succulents and secondhand books. A jazz record played softly in the background. She ordered a chai latte and chose a corner table near the window. As she sat, she took out a small notebook, one she hadn't touched in months, and opened it to a blank page. Her pen hovered, uncertain. Words didn't come. She looked out at the street instead, watching people pass by in pairs or small groups, coats open, laughter unguarded. She felt both near and far from them, like a person behind glass. "Is the seat taken?" a voice asked. She turned. A man stood beside her table, tall, with dark blonde hair and glasses that caught the afternoon light. His expression wasn't forceful, just curious, maybe a little amused. He held a sketchbook under one arm and a cup of coffee in his hand. "No," she said, reflexively polite. "Go ahead." He sat without hesitation, but not in a way that invaded. He placed the sketchbook on the table and opened it to a page filled with loose illustrations. Hands in motion, cityscapes, a woman with her hair caught in wind. He didn't introduce himself right away. Instead, he sipped his coffee and let silence settle, as if testing whether the moment would allow something more. "I like this spot," he finally said. "The light's good for drawing people who don't know they're being watched." She glanced at him, unsure whether to smile or retreat. But there was no arrogance in his tone, only observation. "I wasn't watching you," he added quickly. "Not like that. I just noticed your eyes. You look like you're carrying something heavy." Emily's heart didn't race. It didn't flutter. It did something quieter. It paused, not in fear, but in a strange sort of recognition. No one had spoken to her like that in a long time. Noticed something in her, without trying to fix it or pull it out. "Maybe I am," she said. He nodded, as if she confirmed something he already knew. "I'm Jason," he said, extending a hand. "Emily." They didn't shake hands. It would have felt too formal, too much. But her name lingered between them like something finally allowed to exist. Their conversation was hesitant at first, like two people learning a dialect they used to speak but had forgotten. He asked about her notebook. She shrugged. "I used to write. It doesn't come easily anymore." He didn't push. Instead, he flipped to a sketch of an old man feeding pigeons and said, "I draw when I can't talk. It helps me listen." She found herself asking about his work. He was a freelance illustrator, mostly children's books, though he also designed album covers and occasionally painted murals for local businesses. He'd moved to Fairhaven 6 months ago from Pittsburgh, looking for quiet and space to breathe. Emily didn't tell him much about herself. She didn't talk about the flower shop or the apartment above the empty bookstore or the pieces of herself she was still trying to gather. But Jason didn't seem to need explanations. He filled the space with stories that didn't demand answers, about a cat he once tried to adopt that turned out to belong to his neighbor, or a time he spilled coffee on a publisher's manuscript and had to illustrate an apology card. She laughed, not loudly, not carelessly, but it was real. And when she did, Jason didn't seize on it or make a performance. He just smiled, like someone grateful to witness something unspoken. They stayed there for hours, the sun shifting across the wooden floors, people coming and going around them. Emily hadn't planned to stay that long, but she didn't feel trapped in time. She felt suspended, held by the safety of not having to pretend. When she finally stood to leave, Jason didn't ask for her number. He didn't offer some clever line or suggest they meet again. Instead, he said, "You seem like someone who deserves to be heard. If today helped, I'm glad." And that, more than any promise, more than any plan, left a mark. Emily walked home slowly, her notebook in her bag, still blank. But her thoughts moved differently now. Something had shifted, not because of Jason himself, but because of the space he made simply by seeing her without expectation. That night, for the first time in over a year, she cooked a real meal. Not just something to survive on, but something warm, something intentional. She ate with the lights on. She lit a candle. Later, before bed, she opened her notebook and wrote one line. Maybe healing doesn't look like being strong. Maybe it just looks like showing up. She didn't know what would come next, but she had walked into a cafe as a ghost of herself. And somehow, over coffee and scattered sketches, something had stirred. Not a fire. Not yet, but a spark. A single, undeniable spark. It was never just one moment that turned things around. For Emily, healing was a mosaic of tiny decisions stitched across days, each one braver than the last. And as spring unfolded into the slow golden stretch of summer, she found herself standing in spaces she had once avoided, emotionally and otherwise. Jason remained a presence in her life, not with urgency, but with a quiet, constant rhythm. They began seeing each other more often, first at the cafe where they met, and then during walks along the river or afternoons spent thumbing through vintage books at the market. He didn't rush her. If anything, he seemed attuned to the subtle terrain she was navigating. Sometimes they spoke deeply, other times not at all, and in those silences, Emily found the rarest kind of safety, the freedom to exist without performance. But even as their connection deepened, Emily knew there was work to be done that no one else could do for her. She started therapy in late June. It wasn't a decision made in confidence, but one born from necessity. She begun noticing a pattern. Every time Jason showed kindness, every time he made her laugh or listen without interruption, she'd feel a flicker of joy and then immediately a wave of dread. The old voice would rise, subtle but sharp. "You don't deserve this. It won't last. He'll see who you really are." After one such evening, walking home from Jason's apartment after watching an old black and white film, she stood at her bathroom mirror and saw something in her reflection she hadn't expected. Fear not of pain, but of love. It was terrifying to want something again, to risk being seen, to risk needing. Her first therapy session was awkward. The room smelled faintly of eucalyptus, and the therapist, a woman named Denise, had a calm, measured voice that reminded Emily of NPR broadcasts. She didn't open up right away. Instead, she gave clipped answers, uncertain where to begin or whether she even had a story worth telling. But Denise didn't seem fazed. She asked gentle questions, never pushing, and by the third session, something cracked open. "I don't know who I am without the voice that tells me I'm not enough," Emily admitted one morning, her hands twisting in her lap. Denise looked at her without pity, only clarity. "That voice isn't yours. It was given to you. The work now is learning how to return it." It was a strange idea. That pain could be something inherited, absorbed rather than born. But it made sense. The echoes of Ryan's words had become a language Emily knew by heart, a cruel dialect she hadn't realized she was fluent in. Therapy didn't erase that language, but it taught her how to speak over it. There were weeks when progress felt glacial. Days when she woke up and still felt like the girl left behind, the one who had been told she was too much and never enough all at once. But then there were moments, tiny, potent ones, that reminded her she was changing. One of those moments came when she found the old messages. She hadn't gone looking for them. While organizing files on her computer one evening, she opened a folder she didn't recognize and found screenshots, old conversations with Ryan she had once saved during the unraveling of their relationship. Her instinct was to delete them immediately to avoid the spiral, but she didn't. She sat down, opened the first file, and began to read. The words were cruel, yes, but also hollow manipulative, veiled in false concern or passive-aggressive sarcasm. What struck her wasn't the pain of the messages, but the clarity of seeing them now with distance. She no longer saw herself as the problem in those exchanges. She saw a younger version of herself try and make sense of love through someone else's fractured definition. When she closed the last message, she didn't cry. Instead, she breathed deeply and whispered aloud, "That wasn't love." Just that. 3 words said not for anyone else, but for herself. She didn't need anyone to confirm it. She finally knew it. A few days later, after a session with Denise, Emily went home and opened Instagram. It had been months since she posted anything personal. Her page was mostly flower arrangements and the occasional photo of Fairhaven's sleepy streets. But that night, she sat down at her desk, opened her notebook, and wrote out a piece of her story. She didn't name anyone. She didn't use bitterness or anger as a crutch. Instead, she wrote honestly about unlearning self-hatred, about the slow work of repairing trust not just in others, but in herself. She wrote about the therapy sessions, the days she didn't feel worthy, and the moments that began to stitch her back together. It wasn't polished. It wasn't poetic, but it was real, and she posted it. The response stunned her, not because it went viral, not at first, but because people began messaging her. Friends she hadn't spoken to in years, strangers from nearby towns, women who had walked similar paths. They wrote, not to give advice, but to say thank you, to say, me too, to say, I didn't know how to talk about it either. Within days, the post gained traction. It was shared widely, especially among accounts that centered mental health and recovery. Emily didn't chase the attention. In fact, she turned off notifications, overwhelmed by the magnitude, but she read every comment. And with each message, a strange shift occurred. For years, her pain had felt isolating, like a secret too heavy for light. But now, she saw that naming it had offered a kind of freedom, not just for herself, but for others too. Jason was quiet about the post at first. He didn't flutter with compliments or applause. He waited a day, then stopped by the flower shop with 2 iced teas and said, I read it, and I think it's one of the bravest things I've ever seen. She didn't need more than that. By summer's end, Emily felt different. Not fixed, not finished, but different. She no longer avoided mirrors. She no longer apologized for taking up space. And though the old voice still whispered sometimes, it no longer dictated her life. Something had changed. The past was no longer a place she lived. It was something she had survived. And from that place, scarred but standing, she began to imagine a future. It was a gray October morning when Jason first mentioned the idea of designing their wedding invitations by hand. They were sitting on the floor of his living room, surrounded by pencils, paper swatches, and half-finished illustrations. A soft drizzle tapped against the windows, blurring the outside world into watercolor. The moment wasn't grand. There was no violin swell, no cinematic music, just the comfortable rustle of pages, and the subtle hum of possibility in the air. What if we don't order them? Jason asked, sketching a loose outline of a vine wrapping around a heart. What if we make them? Emily looked up from her mug of coffee, slightly amused. Make our own wedding invitations? He nodded, barely looking up. Why not? We've never done anything by the book. Why start now? She smiled, unsure whether he meant the literal invitations or the relationship itself. Either way, she agreed. It felt right. They weren't engaged yet, at least not in the traditional sense. There had been no proposal, on one knee, no sparkling diamond, no audience. Instead, the conversation had happened during a late-night drive back from visiting Jason's sister in Philadelphia. The radio had played softly, and Jason had said, in the most matter-of-fact tone imaginable, I want to marry you. Not someday. Just when you're ready. Emily hadn't answered immediately. Her fingers had tightened on the steering wheel, heart hammering in her chest. But after a long pause, she'd whispered, Then let's make sure we're ready together. That was all. No announcement followed. No ring selfies. It was theirs, quiet, solid, and growing like something planted deeply. Now, weeks later, the invitations became a kind of ritual. Each weekend, they met to work on them. Emily chose a paper, a soft off-white with tiny speckles that reminded her of pressed petals. Jason illustrated the borders, wildflowers, vines, and tiny birds in flight. They debated fonts, tried out different inks, and sat in silence for long stretches, letting the act of creating become something more than just a task. The words on the invitation took longer. Emily was the one who suggested the line. They had been brainstorming phrases, quotes from poems, fragments of vows, when she paused mid-sentence and said, "What about something we've learned, not something we borrowed?" Jason looked up, his pencil stilling. "Like what?" She hesitated, then pulled out a scrap of paper she had written on weeks earlier. She handed it to him. The ink smudged slightly in the corner. "The love grows where courage is planted." He read it twice, then nodded slowly. "That's it." Neither of them said more. They didn't need to. That single sentence carried the weight of everything unspoken. The night she had doubted herself, the days she had chosen to stay, the countless small moments where bravery had looked like getting out of bed, answering a call, letting someone in. When the first batch of invitations was finished, Emily held one in her hands and stared at it for a long time. It wasn't just a card. It was proof of work, of survival, of the decision to believe in something again. They planned a small ceremony, not a grand affair, but an intimate gathering in the field behind her aunt's farmhouse, an open space surrounded by trees and wildflowers, where laughter didn't echo so much as settle warmly into the earth. Emily wanted it to feel like a beginning, not a performance. A few days later, one of Jason's friends, a photographer named Alana, asked if she could post a picture of the invitation on her design blog. Emily hesitated. The idea of exposing something so personal made her chest tighten. But Jason reminded her gently, "You've already shared your story. This is just another chapter." So they agreed. The post went live on a Thursday afternoon. By nightfall, it had been shared hundreds of times, then thousands. Not just because the design was beautiful, though it was delicate illustrations, handwritten text, soft details. What caught people's attention was the caption Alana added beneath the photo. She was told no one would ever love her. This is her invitation to prove otherwise. The word struck something deep and raw. Comments poured in. People asked about the couple. Some shared their own stories of heartbreak, of healing, of learning to love again. Others simply reposted the image with a single word: hope. The next morning, Emily opened her phone to find her inbox flooded. Messages from strangers, interview requests. A producer from a small local TV show asked if they'd be willing to appear on a segment about love stories. She stared at the message, frozen. Jason found her in the kitchen, her phone on the counter, her face pale. "I didn't ask for this," she said quietly. "I didn't mean for it to go so far." He took her hand without saying anything, just stood beside her until the noise in her mind softened. "You didn't ask for it," he said finally, "but maybe it needed to be heard anyway." They agreed to the interview, but on their terms. No invasive questions, no sensationalism, just their story as it was. A few weeks later, they sat on a small stage under soft lighting, facing a kind interviewer who asked thoughtful questions. Emily spoke calmly, her voice steady, about the importance of choosing oneself before choosing someone else. She talked about healing, about Jason, about writing her way back to herself. The segment aired the next evening. It was simple, heartfelt, quiet, and it touched more people than they expected. That night, live beside Jason under a patchwork quilt, Emily whispered, "You think this matters? All of this?" He turned to her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I think stories like yours teach people how to find their own. That matters." She nodded, staring at the ceiling, her heart oddly still. Not because nothing was happening, but because everything that mattered already had. She was no longer living for survival. She was living with intention. And the invitation, now etched in memory and shared across the world, had done something she hadn't planned. It had freed her, not from the past, but from the idea that the past was all she would ever be. The morning of the wedding arrived cloaked in the kind of stillness that only comes after a storm. Rain had fallen the entire night before, soft and persistent. The sky a heavy gray that clung to the landscape with stubborn melancholy. Emily had awoken before sunrise, not with anxiety or a flood of emotion, but with a calm that surprised her. She lay in bed for several long minutes, listening to the silence that pressed in through her open window, the faint dripping of rain from the eaves, the occasional chirp of a bird braving the damp morning, the soft rustle of leaves. For a moment, she forgot it was her wedding day. She was simply a woman listening to the world wake up. Downstairs, the farmhouse was already buzzing with quiet activity. Her aunt had been up since 5, making tea and arranging breakfast pastries in the kitchen. Friends moved gently around the house, whispering, carrying dresses and curling irons and bouquets wrapped in ribbon. But Emily remained upstairs, sitting at her vanity in a cotton robe, staring at her own reflection with an expression not of nerves, but of reverence. She had chosen a dress weeks earlier, hand-sewn by a local seamstress who worked out her home 3 blocks from the flower shop. It was simple, off-white linen, fitted at the waist, with soft sleeves that floated just above her elbows and a delicate row of buttons down the back. When she had first tried it on, she'd run her hands along the seams and whispered to the mirror, "This feels like me." That was all she needed. Her hair, usually left undone, was pinned loosely with small braids tucked behind her ears, and in it were woven tiny wildflowers. Queen Anne's lace, baby's breath, and a single sunflower, her favorite, positioned just above the nape of her neck. The ceremony took place just after noon, in the field behind the farmhouse, where wild grass swayed and the earth smelled rich and clean after the rain. Folding chairs had been set up in neat rows, and mason jars filled with sunflowers marked the aisle. The sky had cleared hours before, leaving behind a bright, open blue and a soft breeze that lifted the edges of the linen tablecloths at the reception. Jason stood at the front, not in a tuxedo, but in a light gray suit, sleeves rolled up just slightly, his hands clasped calmly in front of him. He didn't look nervous. He looked present, his eyes fixed on the path where Emily would soon appear. And then she did. There was no dramatic music, no fanfare, just the sound of soft instrumental guitar, played live by a friend, and the rustle of her dress as she walked. Each step measured, her gaze steady. She walked alone. It had been a deliberate choice, not out of defiance or symbolism, but because the path she had walked to get to this moment was one she had traveled largely by herself. When she reached the end of the aisle, Jason didn't take her hand right away. They simply stood, side by side, breathing the same air, grounded in the same soil. The officiant, a friend of theirs named Mariah, began with a brief welcome. But the true moment of gravity came when Emily stepped forward to speak first, something she had quietly requested months before. She held a folded piece of paper, but she didn't look at it. Her voice, though not loud, carried clearly across the field. "I spent a long time believing that love was something I had to earn," she began. "That being seen meant being judged. That being vulnerable meant being weak. I spent even longer learning how wrong I was." A hush settled. Even the wind seemed to still. "I used to think that the love I was given defined my worth. But what I've learned is that the love I accept reflects the love I've given to myself. And this," she glanced at Jason, eyes steady, "this isn't about being rescued. This isn't about proving anything to anyone. This is about honoring the quiet work of healing. The messy, beautiful, silent work that no one applauds, but that builds a foundation for everything." She paused, not because she had lost her place, but because the weight of what she was saying needed room. "This marriage isn't the answer to my pain. It's the gift I get for not letting that pain decide the rest of my life." There were tears in the audience. Family, friends, even a few strangers who followed her story and been invited through the ripple of connection her words had made online. But Emily stood unshaken, not because she was unmoved, but because she had already cried the tears that mattered. This was not a day for sorrow. This was a day for arrival. Jason stepped forward next, his voice ruffled with emotion, though no less certain. "I have loved you quietly and patiently, Not because I was waiting for you to change, but because I believed in the person you already were. I've watched you rebuild yourself with tenderness and honesty, and that has taught me more about strength than anything else in my life. I don't vow to fix you. I vow to walk beside you, through the quiet, through the storms, through every season that follows. When the vows ended, there was no dramatic pause, no formal declaration needed. Jason reached for her hand, and she nodded once, her smile not wide but deep. The kiss they shared was soft, short, sincere. Later, at the reception beneath the tent strung with lights, laughter bubbled freely. There were toasts and dancing, and plates full of local food. Jason and Emily swayed together to an old song neither of them could name, holding each other not like a couple on display, but like two people who knew what it cost to reach that moment. At one point, Emily stepped away from the crowd and wandered to the edge of the field, standing beneath a tree where the sun filtered through the branches in long, golden ribbons. She looked back at the people gathered, her eyes catching glimpses of joy, of friendship, of the ordinary kind of magic that lives in shared celebration. And she whispered to herself, "I am not the girl he left. I am the woman who stayed." The wedding didn't mark a destination. It marked the beginning of a life not defined by pain, but by what came after, by what she chose, by who she had become. Not because she had been saved, but because she had saved herself.